All right. Why don't we let me tee this up, and we'll begin this experiment. Thank you for those of you who are able to join, and I look forward to hearing some feedback on how we might make this better going forward. Since this is the place we're going to be meeting each week. And so there's some things, as I said in my note that I sent out, that we'll have to adjust and make work. But I think we've got plenty of technology at our fingertips, and we're all comfortable with working online, so we should be able to make a good go of this. I'm delighted today to have Bob Charette join us, and Bob will tell you a bit more about his background. I'll just make a note that he's managing director at Decision Empowerment Institute near Washington, D.C., and a contributing editor and other roles that he has at IEEE. And then we met actually last semester at John King's SI-345 consulting class, where we were both guest speakers. So Bob, welcome.
Thank you.
Turn the floor over to you, and go ahead and share your screen.
All right, all right, super.
There you go. Okay, great.
Ed asked me to talk about kind of my experiences in project management. And I always look at projects as kind of a Rube Goldberg approach. And in the appendix, you actually, I've copied what this particular Rube Goldberg device does and how it works. But for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Rube Goldberg was a journalist and cartoonist who came up with different ways of actually trying to kind of shed light on technology. And this was his take on how you create, as an innovator, a self-operating napkin. And you can kind of follow the letters. I won't go through it. You can look at it at the end in the appendix. But what's interesting is that if you take a look at IT systems and what we're going to talk about, is that a lot of it is kind of like this. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of change, a lot of things that have to go right for the whole thing to work. Now, Ed mentioned that I have a little bit of background. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. I've been in the business since 1971 was my first computer job when I was at University of Massachusetts. And I've done everything from real-time direct code, assembly code, high-level code. I've been on National Academy Sciences and Engineering panels. I was on the Challenger post-shuttle crash safety investigation. I was there at the University of Michigan on a Big 12 university panel assessing the state of IT security, which you really don't want to know about. I've been on everything on electronic health records. I'm a senior life member of the IEEE. I'm a gold core member of the IEEE Computer Society, which means that they think that I've actually contributed something to the field a little bit. And I've been writing for Spectrum and lots of other computer magazines for a very, very long time, and have probably published about 500 or so articles in total and a couple thousand blog posts. If you're really bored, you can go on Google and find out more about me, but I've been around the business a fair long time. Now, what we're going to talk about is, in the next 30 minutes or so, is kind of three major ideas. Why do we even care about IT and IT projects? We're going to talk about what is kind of a almost a premise that IT projects, if you ask most people, do they think that an IT project is going to succeed or fail? Well, you're going to find that most of the time people, including in any organization you work with, are betting on failure. They hope you succeed, but they don't really expect it. And we're going to talk about why that occurs. And then we're going to talk about how you can manage risk in these IT projects, some of the ideas and some of the patterns that have emerged over the years, and some of the experiences that I had, Ed has, John King has. Lots of people have talked about these, and hopefully we'll give you some keys that as you go into projects and you manage projects, or you're part of a large project, that you'll be able to call on and say, yeah, maybe this is a question or two I should ask. Is that clear? I see everybody nodding their head. So let's start off first about what, and this is more the European term, ICT, information and communications technology. And I like that because information technology is a big part of it, but communication technology, telcos, although it's part of, some people view it as part of IT, a lot of people view it separately, but together, that's really the whole information technology in the big sense. That's the term I like to use. So what has it done for you? And we're going to talk about what it's done to you and society over the past 70 years. Move forward. Thank you. If we really take a look, I was trying to think about what has really changed in your lifetime. Most of you are probably under the age of 30. A lot of you are probably in your low 20s. And if you take a look since the year 2000, and in fact 1999, when the BlackBerry came out, those of you who don't know, the BlackBerry was a feature phone. It was the first feature phone. And about 8 years later, you had the iPhone, which was considered the first smartphone. And if you take a look at just the global reach of cellular telephone subscriptions, we're talking about that if you take a look at the world population, everybody has about 4 phones, which is kind of interesting. Now, obviously, not everybody has 4 phone subscriptions, but that's how many subscriptions are out there. And if you take a look at a country like Afghanistan, which has been war-torn for 40 years or more, you see that in the year 2000, there was only 788 internet users, but in the last 20 years, there's millions. And this is in a country that is been racked by war since 1979. And if you take a look, the numbers that I have over on the left, or the companies, those Apple, Samsung, Huawei, and the others, those make up about 80% of all the cell phone manufacturers and market share. So just it's really hard to, because you haven't grown up before this world occurred. This is a staggering amount of technological change in an incredibly short period of time. And it's something that, with internet, with Facebook, with Instagram, LinkedIn, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. We're all in this globalized arena, which, again, as Ed and I were talking about, was science fiction when we were your age, literally. No one would have predicted this is where we're at. And in fact, if you take a look at all the areas that IT has affected, there's not one that hasn't been affected, from mining to aircraft, education, healthcare. We're getting Bluetooth toothbrushes. These are things that IT is literally in every single thing that we do. And in the next 30 years, it will be incredibly pervasive, which is both good and bad. And if you take a look, the period we're in right now, which is very important for you to understand, is that about every 20, 25 years, there's a major tsunami of technologies that occur in computing. The last really big one before what we're experiencing now was about 1990 to about 1995. And this was when we started moving to 32-bit microprocessors. We had this idea of technology fusion, which was to integrate different types of computing into single devices. We had this idea of mesh connections, which is actually what the internet became, with the ARPANET then becoming the internet. Wireless networks were just appearing, client-server architectures, things like PC digital imaging. Photoshop came out in 1990. Okay, so if you take a look at what happened then, it's taken all these technologies over the last 30 years have formed the backbone for all these new ones that we have: smart algorithms, big data, robotics, 3D printing, nanotechnologies, neurotechnologies, where we have computing into the body, the remote sensors, which has been huge in allowing us to do things like the Internet of Things, as well as autonomous transport. So it's going to take about, if past history is true, it's going to take about 20 years to absorb this latest group, which will then create yet another tsunami based on all the integrations of all these technologies. So if we take a look, and this is from the 1964 World's Fair, which they were viewing what would be the world of the future, circa about the year 2000. All these things, which we're still trying to get, is going to be intertwined with IT, and especially IT that hopefully works. But all those benefits are not without risk or cost. We're going to talk in more detail about this, but these are just a small, infinitesimal number of IT systems that have gone belly up or are causing problems, operational causes. For instance, right now, this is the 4th year that the new payroll system for the government in Canada has not worked. So for 4 years, 90% of the civil service in Canada have had pay problems. They expect those pay problems will continue for another 3 to 4 years. So can you imagine not having either being underpaid, overpaid, or not paid at all on kind of a weekly, or biweekly basis, and not knowing whether or not you're going to get paid? It's a amazing problem that they have. And what's interesting there is that their original cost that they thought they were going to spend on this new payroll system was in the neighborhood of about $45 to $50 million US. They're going to spend about $2 billion fixing it. Think about that. A $50 million system is going to cost them $2 billion to get right. And these other ones are very similar. The Department of Unemployment in Michigan, what they did is that they, with their new AI-driven system, they accused 40,000 innocent people of unemployment theft in the state of Michigan. They caused people to lose their homes. They caused people to almost go to prison. They caused suicides of people who were pursued by the state. So if you don't get these things right, there's tremendous consequences, not only for society, but more importantly for individuals, because computing touches all of us, individuals. And it's important to understand what that means. If you take a look at most of the cyber attacks that have occurred, most of these were preventable, but there were deliberate decisions not to spend the money on IT security when these systems were built. So we're basically reaping what we sowed. So with these failures, what we really need to do is understand what causes them so that we can quit reducing or eliminating all the benefits that IT has for us. And the costs, again, are these opportunity costs, not only for government, but for organizations, are huge. This sounds like a really over-the-top statement, but this is actually based on at least 1,500, and right now it's probably closer to 2,500 IT projects. Bent Flyberg and Alexander Budzier are at Oxford University, and I would really suggest that you read every paper that these two guys have written. Budzier was a PhD student at Oxford. He was out of McKinsey's, And McKinsey's has probably the best data on project success and failure in the planet, mostly because they've actually tracked projects from what they plan to do and what they actually did do. A lot of the data that exists out there in the field is after the fact data versus following projects from the very beginning to the very end. So they have plan versus actual data. Now, what they've done, and I should also mention that Bent Flyberg is a civil engineer, actually, and he's been tracking large-scale project failures, infrastructure failures, dams, airports, big construction projects. So he has that side of the field, where Alexander is from the IT community. And their data shows that IT projects typically fail 20 times more than other types of projects, which is absolutely huge when you think about the number of big projects that fail. In fact, their study, and this is again from 2011, they've been updating it ever since, is that the actual average cost overrun is about 27%, and the schedule overrun for most IT projects is 55%. Now, one of the things that they really want you to understand is that this is average, because what you really have is you have these big fat, what they call fat tails, which is 1 in 6 of IT projects are what they consider black swans, with an average cost overrun of 200% on average and a schedule overrun of almost 70%. The slide I had before where I talked about Canada, it's a lot more than 200%.
Hey, Bob, you may want to just briefly explain what a black swan is for those who may not have heard the term before.
Okay, in the risk field, a black swan, in fact, the coronavirus is considered a black swan, or the COVID-19, to be used a more current term. The idea is that you're going to have situations which are considered to be outliers, but these outliers happen a lot more than what you actually think. And in fact, it's hard to call a 1 in 6 chance something that's an outlier. There's another term in risk management which we call white swans, which are basically predictable failures or predictable events. So black swans are supposed to be these things that occur only once in a great while. And a lot of times black swans are viewed in any industry as something that is really highly improbable, but in fact they do happen with some level of regularity. Is that clear to everyone?
Yep.
Now, what's more interesting from their data, and this is something that kind of surprised me, and I've been doing cost estimates and project failure analysis for a long time, was that they were able to show that if a project has a cost overrun of 20% halfway through the original schedule, the most reasonable estimate of how large the overrun actually follows a power law. And that power law in the distribution actually pushes the overrun not to double, but to one that's 540% at the end. So one of the key things, if you're a project manager, is to take a look at your cost overrun at your predicted period at halfway through what you think your schedule is supposed to be. If it's 20%, you better start digging in fast, because it may be running out of control. Now, in the original paper I sent to Ed, and probably what he's going to put out, is I had a different reference. I've put in a new reference, Ed, down here at the bottom, with their much more detailed paper. And so if you can copy and send that to them, or that would be great. I'll send you that individually so that so your students have that. It's a very long, detailed paper, and it'll tell you all about the distribution that they're using.
I'll make sure your presentation deck is posted in our Canvas files section, and then in your notes part of your slides, then is where you have those links.
Right. Okay. Very good. Now, another group. This is a group that's up in New York, the Consortium for IT Software Quality. They took some estimates of how much do the cost, what I call cost of deviations from the expected, what people expect they were supposed to be spending in IT and what's actually happening, is that they think that IT failures around the world are in the trillions of dollars. And in fact, in the US, they estimate that the total cost of IT problems is about $2.84 trillion annually. Now, I'm not sure I actually believe that, because I think that's probably an overestimate. But the numbers, at least from a ratio standpoint, are probably not far off. Now, what they claim is that there's 4 different types. There's problems with operational systems, which is kind of finding and fixing operational deficiencies and massive failure consequences. So those are things that you're finding, like if you have your bank, you can't get on your bank application, you can't make phone calls, these things that occur, and there's hundreds of these every week. So if you spread that across the total United States, they estimate that there's about $1.4 trillion in cost in trying to fix operational failures that occur in IT systems across the United States, both commercial and government. Then they say, well, if we take a look at trying to fix unreleased deficiencies, do the rework, all the canceled projects, all the things that cost internally to corporations, then they think it's about $0.8 trillion, or about 800 billion. Then they take a look and they say, okay, well, what about the violations of good practice, or fixing problems that you need to fix, that these are fixes that you had from the future that you're now having to do today. And they think that there's another, $540 billion in cost. And what's interesting is that the management failures, which are the unanticipated costs, customer damages, reactive crisis mode management behaviors, they don't have a clue. It's really huge. And in some sense, if you think about it, when you read a story, say, for instance, if a reservation system goes belly up on an airline, you may find out that the airline says, well, it cost us $50 million to fix, with lost flights, with the remediation of the IT system. But think about, where's the cost computed to, say, the 100,000 flyers who lost their flights or had massive delays? And so those business costs, you're never going to find computed. And so this is one of the more interesting things, is that when you do risk assessments and you take a look at what companies or government does, is that they almost never, ever compute the cost to their customers of an outage that they created, which is something that is really very foolish, and also totally underestimates the cost-benefit ratios that you're trying to create. So I'm going to turn my attention now a little bit to the principles of automation, which, as I say, are too often misunderstood and forgotten, but are really one of the primary reasons why we get into the problems that we do. This is probably the most famous of all the books that have been written. It's probably one of the most cited, if it's not the most cited book in computing. It's by Dr. Fred Brooks, who I think he's retired now, but his last position was at a professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina in computer science. But Dr. Brooks has been around for a very long time, and he wrote this book on the Mythical Man Month, and out of that were a number of essays, including this one that came out later, which was No Silver Bullet: Essence and Accidents of Software Engineering. And this particular paper has been cited forever as well. And what he writes is, he says that, I believe the hardest part of building software to be the specification, design, and testing of this conceptual construct, not the labor of representing it and testing the fidelity of the representation. However frustrated we may be with writing of computer programs, we will never find a magic transformational breakthrough. We should expect only modest incremental advances. Now, the thing is that it's a running, I'm not sure it's a joke, but there's a kind of the holy grail is to find some, what we call the silver bullet of how do you create software that works really well the first time, does what you want, and never fails. I've been in the business for, as I said, nearly 50 years. We've been looking for this, and we'll probably still be looking for this 50 years from now, because no matter what you read about things like low code or agile or lean, and I'm the person who helped start the lean software development. And in fact, the agile people took my lean principles and put it into manifesto. We can talk about that later at some other time. But the whole idea is the problem that we have in trying to build these systems are these four basic things. One is the level of complexity. There's really, in some sense, no level of, no scale issue. We can continue to connect and connect and connect and connect. And one of my rules of risk management is that the risk lies in the interfaces. So if you think about the World Wide Web and you think about how many connections there are, and those connections can have errors propagate across every one of those interfaces, you can start to think about how hard it is to actually make sure you understand what's going on in a system. Dr. Brooks also talked about conformity, and what he's really talking about is that it's the non-conformity. We can have lots of heterogeneous elements connecting through these interfaces. If you're building a physical system, the parts all kind of have to mesh together. But in the systems that we build, we don't have to have a lot of conformity. We can build things that are running different operating systems, different software, different programs, different data, and we can still kind of connect them together. But that also means that we have to understand all those different things that are operating and their particular context. Furthermore, we can change all this. We can make it really easy. Dr. Brooks and a lot of others who've been in the field longer than me, one of the major things that if you ask them, they'll tell you that writing code is too easy because we can change it. It's incredibly powerful that we can change it, but because we can change it, it also means that we can introduce error. And that error, again, can propagate across these interfaces. And of course, the last thing is software is invisible. You know, we see the effects of software, but we don't sit there looking at bits. If I'm working on my bicycle and I have a problem with the gears, I can look at the gears. I can see if the gears are worn. I can see if the chain is off or needs grease. There's things there that I can see. I can't do that. All I can do is see the effects of software. Now, those things come together in what we would call interconnectivity or integration imperialism. What I mean by that is that ever since the beginning of computing, we have looked at how do we add one more system? And we try to connect more and more systems. And so we take a look at the web, we take a look at electronic health records, we take a look at autonomous cars or even the cars today. You know, right now, a normal average car has nearly 100 microprocessors and 100 million lines of code. That's a tremendous amount of software just in an individual vehicle. And as we go to autonomous vehicles, we're talking about potentially 1 billion lines of code in an autonomous system for a truck or your local car. In fact, one of the issues that we also have is what we call, testing dissonance. We have a situation where it's nearly impossible for us to test these systems. We cannot do end-to-end testing anymore because of all these different interconnections. And so all we can do is test a part of the system and hope that it all works. And that's one of the things that really has become a major problem in the Department of Defense. It's a problem in space. You probably heard recently about the Starliner issue with Boeing. that they didn't do an end-to-end test. They thought they could integrate these disparate parts and do a quick test through simulation. And when they launched, they found out that, lo and behold, things didn't work the way they thought or the simulation told them. And that's one of the things that you'll find, that lots of things work well in the lab and they don't work the moment you bring them out and do anything live with them. Another issue, a core issue with computing, is what we call the automation paradox. Erica Rovira, who's a professor at US Military Academy and is a human factors expert, I did a story for Spectrum called Automated to Death, which took a look at the problems of relying on computing in different transportation systems. And if you think about it, on an aircraft, right, the aircraft has a tremendous amount of automation. But when the aircraft automation doesn't know what to do, it says, basically it turns it over to the pilot and says, you guys figure it out, because I can't. Now, think about that for a few minutes. Right here you have a system that pilots are not trained to understand. Pilot training today is to keep them totally unaware of the inner workings of their avionic systems. In fact, they're black boxes to them. So when the black box doesn't work, they're supposed to figure out what happens. And in fact, if we've seen with the 737 Max crashes, that the automation was totally misunderstood by the pilots because they weren't trained in it. They didn't understand what was going on, and it killed nearly 400 people. So again, it's one of the things that you have to be very careful of as a designer and as a project manager on these types of systems, to understand what are the assumptions that you're making about IT and what happens when the IT doesn't work, especially in systems that have safety implications to them, whether or not it be something like an aircraft or just something like a hospital system. Another issue that really wasn't thought about very much in the beginning of computing is how long these systems are going to last. In fact, there's kind of this paradox where we have, the more successful the system, the longer it is that it's going to be there in your organization, and it's going to be harder and harder to replace, because that data you capture more and more data, and it's very costly to move data from one system to another. And it's also hard to capture all that original functionality. And in fact, 80% of all IT and ICT spending today is spent on supporting existing systems. In fact, if you take a look at the IRS systems that are in place in the United States, one of the core, in fact, the two core systems, the one that has all the taxpayer information, individual, as well as the business information, is from 1959. They've been trying to replace that system since the early 1960s, and they have not been successful yet. It's only been in the last year that the actual nuclear codes for the US Air Force moved from large, really large 1980 floppy disks to something more modern. So most banks today still run mainframe computers that have 1965 to 1975 code on it. What this means, of course, is that we're going to be in an environment, especially as we move forward, what I call the risk ecology environment, because you have to take a look at all these risks as an ecology, not as isolated instances. So you have all these different things that you have to worry about in computing today, and they all interconnect. You have to worry about the value for money. You have to worry about long-term maintenance. You have to worry about your acquisition strategy. You have to worry about operational risks, strategic risks, insurance risk, financial risk. Most organizations now are moving to cloud technologies or moving to having pure internet where they don't have any hardware. They just are using third-party systems. They don't have their own computing departments anymore. All these things are interacting, and every one of these elements means that there's some level of risk associated with them, and managing one set of these risks is going to cause some other impact someplace else. And unless you're aware and you take a ecological approach to the risks that you have in these projects, you're going to get bit by something, and you're not going to understand what the consequences are. So if we take a look at some of these, again, enduring patterns of difficulties, one of the things I like to ask people is, why do IT projects fail? Well, the reasons projects fail is because they run out of money. They don't provide any organizational value. And there's great personal risk to the original stakeholders. People can talk about they fail because of a lack of communication or poor requirements. At the end of the day, it's all about the money. Even in government, it's about the money. They cannot fund these projects anymore because they just don't provide any value. So if you're talking to senior business people, that's what they're looking at. They're going to be looking at the money. They don't care about the whys. Les Hatton, who's a professor, I think at the University of Edinburgh now, he said quite some time ago that the most significant reason software fails is that we don't learn from our mistakes. We're kind of like Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner cartoons. Hopefully everyone knows that cartoon character. But we keep trying the same things over and over again, and we don't learn. And in fact, what's interesting, kind of like Wile E. Coyote, we don't really try the same thing over and over again. We try something, it doesn't work, we try something else, and we tend not to learn from our mistakes. And just as importantly, we don't tend to learn from what succeeds. It's kind of a dysfunctional and cognitive dissonance that occurs throughout computing. And you see this in terms of warning signs of impending failure for software projects. Now, these are things, this is a list that I came up with. And again, these are issues. They're not root causes in the sense that these are things that you're going to see. You're going to see, if a project is starting to have difficulties, you're going to see poor communication among customers and developers and users. And in fact, if you see that there's poor communications, then you have a problem that's starting to be created. If you have project goals that aren't articulated or unrealistic, you're going to have problems as well. If you're using technology that isn't mature, you're going to have problems. All of these things are going to have possibilities, and if you have more than one, and most projects that have failures or have massive cost overruns have more than one, probably I'd say half or more of these occurring at once. Now, when you say that, you say, well, why does that happen? Well, part of it is that people don't want to ask these questions. These are questions that Ed developed in trying to get you or get an organization to understand where they may have some difficulty. So Ed has, as in this article that he wrote last year, he has 35 different questions that you need to ask about your IT project to understand whether or not you have a high probability of success. And if you go through this, and you actually were to be diligent in ask and answer these, which of course lead to other questions, you probably would have a pretty good chance of being successful. The funny thing is that if you took a list of 35 questions to a project stakeholder, the one who is funding it, they would say, I don't have time to ask these, to answer all these questions. Why are you asking me? I hired you to go do this. Don't bother me with all this. And yet, this is what you could use to help you succeed. And in fact, I've been on projects where project managers and the people who are funding it they don't want to be involved at all. And yet, without their involvement, project success runs towards zero. Another issue that we run into both in terms of support as well as in terms of new development, is this idea of maintenance. One of the things that young programmers, young computer science graduates and computer engineering graduates want to do is work on new stuff. All of that new stuff in that tsunami that I showed earlier. They don't want to work in the maintenance area. You know, who wants to work on things that are old? Who wants to work on a computer systems that's 30 years old? And in fact, once a project goes live, it tends to disappear into the woodwork. And in fact, again, one of the paradoxes is that if you have a successful system, it becomes kind of like the elevator. You know, it's there. You don't notice it being there unless it doesn't work. And so it gets hidden. Yet again, one of the interesting things is that the projects are typically, when you do a cost benefit analysis and you're taking a look at a system in terms of your value proposition, a lot of the times the cost of that system development or that life cycle cost, maintenance is only budgeted for about 20% of the total cost of ownership. But in fact, as I said before, historically it ends up costing 80%. And yet we do not build systems to be maintained. In fact, this is one of the big reasons why we spend 80%, because we have to go and fix things because no one thought about a system living for 25, 30 years or more. And yet almost every system, I'm quite sure I can go to the University of Michigan and find systems that are that old.
Hey, Bob, if we just take a quick pause here, just a time check, about 15 minutes, and I know you've got, I think, about 17 slides to go.
Hey,
so.
I'll get through them, Ed. Don't worry.
All right, thanks. I want to make sure we allow for some questions at the end. By the way, anybody, if you have questions as Bob's speaking, please put them in the chat window, and then when we get to the Q&A part, we can, I'll be happy to read some of those. You could also ask them verbally at that time. Thanks.
So the other section, and this is one that I spend a lot of time in, is that risk perceptions and behaviors that influence project success and failure. And in fact, there's very strong cognitive biases that are at play. You know, we tend to use information in a way that supports our beliefs. And what's interesting in the computer science arena and in developing systems, we do cost estimation using something that has a strong cognitive bias. We tend to do cost estimates by looking and dividing our projects up into pieces. So we say we're going to do part A, which is going to be followed by part B, part C, part D. When we break things up in that sequence, we tend to underestimate the effort that it requires. Now, if you look at a computer design, we tend to design computers in kind of a top-down tree-like fashion in modules and subroutines, et cetera. Unfortunately, that has a strong cognitive bias of underestimating the propagation of error among the trees. So what we actually do within our own, what is being taught at the universities is that we teach people to underestimate their cost and overestimate the reliability of systems. That is our standard operating procedure. And I doubt very many of your professors, if you've taken programming courses or if you've taken cost estimation courses, will actually highlight these cognitive biases, which will actually hurt you in your actual day-to-day business. And in fact, if you take a look, there's lots of things that keep occurring in projects. There's this idea of optimism bias, as I just said. We're very optimistic about what we are able to accomplish in a certain amount of time. And in fact, if you take a look at cost estimates, everybody's above average. No programmer is ever average in a cost estimate. Because no one wants to admit that we have average programmers. So every company will say that we have above average programmers and above average project managers. There's things like correlation bias, where we think that because certain things occur, other things are going to occur as well. And again, we don't understand how things causes. We make mistakes for causes and effects. We also try to treat symptoms. This is a little diagram from some work that I did for the Department of Defense on a major program. And what people see, what people look at, they'll say, well, the project was over budget. That's a cause, or poor product quality was a cause of the failure. And in fact, those are actually only symptoms. If you think about it in a 5Y quality management approach, which I think most of you probably know, you have to trace these things back. So if you take a look at these things like, well, why is there rework? Well, you have, poor technical decisions. Well, that's caused by inadequate staff, but inadequate staff is caused by insufficient funding. Why was there insufficient funding? Because way back in the beginning, somebody decided that they were going to move from a prototype and decide to make that an operational system. But when you make a prototype, you don't do all the things that you normally would do for an operational system. So you don't have the funding, you don't have things like configuration management, you don't have a full design, you don't have the requirements all mapped out. So you got to be very careful about whether or not something's an actual result, a symptom of a symptom, or those different elements. Other aspects that come into play are things what are called in NASA the Hubble psychology, which is another way of saying my project's too big to fail. So we'll always get money. They can't cancel us. In the Department of Defense, the idea is to keep your project alive at all costs, which means that you're not going to be honest about your cost or your schedule or your technical progress. Again, another bias is out of sight, out of mind. If I don't, no one tells me about the risks, they don't exist. And the last one, and something that Ed talks about, is sunk cost mythology, which is, I've put in this amount of money, I might as well keep putting in more money because we should be able to get something out of this at the end of the day. When in fact, most of the time, it'd be better for you to stop and rethink and start over in most cases. Again, going to the Boeing Max 737, another big issue is the ethics that are involved. I talked about this last year or last semester. And ethics is something that every one of you are going to face, because at some point in time, you're going to be faced with a situation where you have to make a decision. And is it the right decision? Is it the ethical decision that you're making? Is it something that you really should not make, but there's pressures within the corporation to make it? In this particular case, they didn't tell the FAA really the issues that were involved with the software in the 737. And so here you have an engineer who, is basically begging God for forgiveness for not raising an issue that is obvious that should have been raised. Couple conclusions. My focus has for 40 years plus now, since I've been doing risk management professionally, is I have found that projects don't fail. Failure is really the wrong term. They blunder the way out of existence. They're predictable surprises. I don't need to have a list of 30 things to tell me that a project's going wrong, because most of the time there's only a few things that are absolutely fundamental that they're not being done. The project isn't going to succeed. For instance, if you don't do configuration management extremely well on a project, you're going to fail because you're not going to be able to keep track of what's being changed. What's worse is that these blunders are really thefts of opportunity, of corporate opportunity, taxpayer opportunity. And I view them as basically fraud. There's very few failures. Failures are things that we do everything that we're supposed to do, and stuff happens. We may push the edge of what we actually know. It's something that we have to learn. But I would say that 80% of all project failures, or what we consider failures, are really blunders, and they could have been successful if we had just followed minimum practice. Things, again, that you can watch for. One of the things we'll ask for, we'll look at is, are there process shortcuts being used? For instance, is configuration management not being followed? Are requirements being jettisoned or deferred, which is called technical debt? Things that we promised we were going to start off this way, but we can't meet that. So to meet our costs or our schedule, we're going to start throwing them till the next version, or we'll fix them in maintenance. Are difficult decisions overdue? Everybody on the project knows that the project's in trouble, yet project management isn't making the decisions to try to correct it. Has the initial risk reward assessment disappeared? That happens quite a bit. They'll do a risk assessment up in the beginning, and then all of a sudden it's never updated, or it just disappears altogether. Negative project measures are rationalized away. You'll say to an organization, well, how come you're slipping on schedule? And they'll come up with 1,000,001 excuses, which basically says the project is out of control. Is staff leading? Or again, one of my favorites is risks. Are they being called challenges? I have a slide in the appendix that uses some of the other euphemisms that you'll find in projects when things start to get in trouble. These are 3 questions that I think are absolutely key. You should be asking yourself, what should I know about my project? And then you should ask, what do I actually know? And then you better ask, how do I close that gap? Because one of the interesting things is that on every project failure before it fails, or every project blunder, I should say, is that more than one person knows. And if you don't ask, you're not going to get. So you should always be asking yourself, what should I know about the project? Where should it be at this point in time? And then you have to ask yourself, what do I actually know about it? And if you have a really wide gap, you got big problems. Here are some charrette rules, if you will, to live under for a project. Make sure you validate your assumptions. Almost every big failure, you'll find a failure of assumptions. The assumptions have been crashed. Your assumptions aren't holding true. You don't understand the unintended consequences. And that's, again, you have to think through what happens if this thing doesn't work. Remember, the risks exist at the interfaces. That's where you need to focus as a project manager. If you can control the interfaces and everybody understands how those interfaces work and the data that's supposed to flow across those, you've solved probably 50% of the major risk in your project. Again, as I said, if you don't ask for information, you don't ask for risks or problems, you're not going to get it. People view risk in most organizations as being unprofessional, that you're not a good engineer, you're not a good software programmer, you're not a good manager. But you have to overcome that negative bias about the word risk. You have to ask for this information because, as I said, someone knows. Another one is these systems are incredibly complex. You have to master the detail. And if you can master the detail, you're going to master the risk. You have to understand all those things that I showed up in that slide in the risk ecology slide. And it's important to remember that risk and opportunity is not about future decisions. It's about the future of your present decisions. So don't think about projects about what's going to happen tomorrow and what decisions you have to make tomorrow. It's about what decisions you're making today, which are going to influence tomorrow. It's always about managing today with an idea of what those consequences are going to be in the future. As I said, most failures, and again, I hate that word, it's really blunders, are preventable. I have decades of experience. We have seen project after project that just went down the tubes and really could have been built and made to work at much less cost, but because they didn't do the things up front that they needed to, the things that hopefully Ed's teaching you, they get themselves into trouble. One thing that is absolutely true is that the cost of failure, the impacts of failure are going to grow. Given technology's course and speed right now, what we see in the technologies that are emerging, and are really starting to be rolled out. It's going to be how well you can manage the risk, the risk ecology that is going to decide whether or not your organization or you personally or society is actually going to prosper. If we take a look at just the Internet of Things and all the sensor data that is going to come in, and all the interconnections and the literally trillions of interfaces that represents, and also the likelihood that in many cases we're going to have very tightly coupled errors. So some device, your Bluetooth toothbrush is going to take down Netflix by some weird interconnection that no one really understands. These are the types of things that are going to start to occur. And if you don't believe me, if you think I'm talking kind of speculatively, there's been many situations on automated cars, for instance, that people have found that by moving their seat, they turn their car off while they're driving. Those are some of the errors that have occurred because people didn't understand how those interfaces all interconnected. So as we start to build these systems, I'm getting out of this field in the next 10 years max, probably a lot sooner than that. So it's going to be up to you to make sure that all this works. So I'm counting on you to make sure that my retirement is risk-free.
Of course, that's one of the things to get used to, as we all have to get used to in terms of an online class, is that, okay, so if you want to stretch or get up out of your seat for a minute, you turn your video off to do that so you're not distracting anybody. But we got some good questions on the chat window, and let me throw some of those out. The first one is how do you break out of the vicious circle of successful systems?
Well, that's something that's a very, very good question. In fact, I'm writing a huge article for IEEE Spectrum on that very subject. Part of it is to understand that systems need to change, and that you need to, in the very beginning of your design, and I'll tell you what you need to do, and what the reality helping prevent this, is that you need to think about, how am I going to capture the data, because the data is really critical, and how am I going to transform that data into different formats that we may need to use in the future. In fact, in the IRS, this is the huge problem, because they use data formats still from the 1960s and 1970s. And those data formats aren't supported by any hardware or software today. And so when you have to convert all that data and clean all that data, that becomes a huge cost. And they never plan for that in the beginning. Companies that actually think about their systems, they think about them in terms of being throwaway systems. They think about, how am I going to capture this data? How am I going to capture this functionality? And how are we going to move forward with it? Back in the early 90s, there's this whole movement, the first really big AI movement. In fact, well, I can't say the first, it was actually the third. We're now in the fourth or fifth iteration of AI. The idea was to capture your functionality in terms of rules that you could state, and then your data would also be captured separately so that it would be hardware independent. So if you can create, and that's again, another holy grail, is to try to make things hardware and software independent. You can't do it completely, but you try to do that as much as possible. Now, the reason why, and this is very common sense. I'm quite sure if you thought about it, and you probably have already thought about it, well, why don't you build systems this way? It's because the upfront cost is very high. All right. The other issue is that the stakeholder who is trying to get this project funded isn't going to worry about the project manager 5 years from now who is stuck with this project. Okay, that's just the reality of the situation, right? That person can't go to the board and say, okay, if we just build this, right now it's going to cost us, say, $10 million, but if we build it so that it can be sustainable and we can fix it in the future, it's going to cost us $30 million up front, but it's going to save us, $100 million down the line in 20 years. They're going to say, ain't my problem.
Right. Right.
Okay. And so this is just the politics. And even in the Department of Defense, where you think that there'd be a lot of money and there'd be a lot of thinking, that doesn't occur. Okay. They, for instance, will throw cybersecurity over the fence and fix it in maintenance versus designing it in.
Right.
We all know better. It's just incredibly hard to overcome that politic.
Okay, next question is, how should you approach building something robust that can withstand a black swan event if you can't really predict when it will happen and on what scale?
That's a good question. You know, black swan events, again, is you can't avoid every one, but in terms of building systems, look, we know how to build systems. There have been very good systems built. There's a lot of information on how to build systems. But again, to do things well costs money. This is going to sound like a broken record, but unfortunately it's true. You can build resilience in, you can build redundancy, you can build fault tolerance into your architectures, into your designs. We know how to do this. This isn't something that we don't know. We know how to do it in pretty much everything. Even in quantum computing, they're looking at redundancy now to make sure that they can have the reliability that they need. We know how to do this. The problem is that doing that not only costs money, but it increases the schedule. So if you have a business need and you say, okay, adding in all this resilience is going to add another year or two to my system, the business need may have gone away. So people make these trade-offs all the time. The trouble is can you make a good business case that actually accounts for those black swans and what that cost would be if a black swan came in? Again, take a look at what we're going through right now. You guys are going online because we as a country did not heed the previous black swans, of which there have been 5 since the year 2000 in healthcare. So that kind of shows you the problems that you run into. I've written several papers back in the 2000, between 2004 and 2010 on business continuity management to take account of things like coronavirus, swine flu, SARS, all these different pandemics that we've been worrying about. And yet today, still less than 40% of organizations have business continuity management plans for IT outages, regardless of type.
Right. Right. And of course, with the whenever you have a health pandemic like we're facing now, one of the key issues in any recovery plan is who's going to execute them.
Yeah.
Right. If people are ill or not available or worse, then the plan sort of falls apart because you don't have the people that are at the controls.
Well, in 2006, a vast majority of East Coast hospitals were on the verge of shutting down during the SARS threat because the healthcare workers had flu.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in the same situation. Now there's study after study after that event saying that, well, we got to deal with that. Well, guess what? They still have to deal with that. Right.
Let me just pick one last question out of this list in the interest of time, and then we can take the other questions offline. How do you pull out the truth in a failing or blundering project when people have the tendency to defend their babies?
Well, what I would do and what we do when we do risk assessments is we go to the most junior team leader, get them in a room individually, and talk to them. and say, okay, if your project, if you were to write a newspaper headline about your project failing, what would it be? And they'll tell you. But if you act, the higher you go, the more you're going to get everything is fine. So you have to go down to the coal face, what we call the coal face, the people who are actually working on the projects, and find out what's going on. If you talk to the people who are actually doing the programming, they know where the problems lie. They know what the difficulties are. Now, really good project managers, this is, again, an old management by walk around. Really good project managers talk to their programmers every day. They find out what's going on. And it's not hard. It's just that it requires you to have discipline, and it requires you not to get upset when somebody tells you that there's a problem.
Right, exactly. Okay, well, I think let's wrap that up. I'll send you the list of the other questions, and
yeah, and I'll answer. I'll have no problem, writing you a little note on those.
But Bob,
I want to thank everybody for their patience.
And thank you for joining us. Very much appreciate it. I'll send you a link to the recording, and good luck with your next presentation in John's class.
Yeah, well, and again, sorry for being a little pedantic, but this is something that if you haven't figured out that I have a little bit of anger below the surface about these failures, you probably weren't listening.
Okay.
Well, I'll sign off then.
All right, Bob. Thanks a lot. Take care.
All right. Bye.
All right. Let's take a 5-minute break as we normally do at the end of the guest speakers. I'll post again in the chat window the feedback form, and I think we figured out how to make that work. And we'll take a 5-minute break, and then I'll run through the lecture for today, which I think you might find useful for the exercise we're going to do on career role playing. So if you're able to stay for that, great. If not, please do watch the recording for this as well. But I'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, we still have everybody. Okay, great. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to fill out the feedback on Bob's presentation. He's a walking historian, if you will, for the IT industry. So hopefully you enjoyed that presentation. Van is up for the 3x3 summary. So these were the readings that we had for this week. A little bit. Well, actually, I've got Phoenix in there twice, so it's not this many readings. But from Be the Business from Phoenix, and Jerry Sternin and Pascali wrote an interesting article, and then Jack Welch, who just passed away the other week, long-term CEO from GE, on his 4 E's and P framework. And then I have in the class plan and in the readings Bob Charrette's article on why software fails that he was referring to in his presentation. So you can, if you'd like to look at that article that he wrote, that is in there as well. So with that in mind, go ahead, Van, and take over the screen and let's go through your slides.
Actually, since you already have it there, I haven't changed any of the content. So I guess
Okay.
you could just press the forward button once I'm done with the slide. All right.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. And and then when we get to the question part, let's try doing live questions. And if that doesn't work well, we'll resort back to the chat window. But I think we have a small enough group where people can come off of mute and ask questions, make comments rather to your questions at the end. Okay. So just don't read through your question slides, but just give us 10 seconds to look at it. Otherwise, just your takeaways.
All right. Okay. So let's start with the Phoenix project here. So these were the remaining last chapters of the book we've been reading all semester. So basically a happy ending, I hope. It really just began with Bill and Eric talking to each other, Eric being the sage Yoda to Bill's Luke, gave him really powerful advice on where to proceed next. So he's telling Bill to start thinking like a plant manager, to kind of get a bird's eye view of the comings and goings of the infrastructure. So I thought it really interesting that Eric says that a business agility is about how good you are at detecting and responding to market changes, and then taking larger and more calculated risks through continual experimentation, and that failure in of itself at this point, which just means that the competitors win. I thought it was pretty succinct. This distillation of everything that Eric has, all the advice he has shared to Bill throughout the entire book. So Bill takes Eric's advice in stride and gets together with his team. They were really, I guess, cautious, to say the least, when Bill was suggesting they change certain their approach to tackling the Phoenix project. But eventually they did. They found out, interestingly enough, that deploying their, automating their deployment through cloud computing was achieved incredible levels of success, and that they want to continue using it for production down the road. And I think, to say the very least, the final chapters really wrapped up the three ways that the author has been trying to drill into our heads throughout the entire book. So the three ways really did save Parts Unlimited. Next slide. So these are the questions I had. Feel free to take a look at it. All right. So the next reading was Be the Business, Growing Your Blended Executives. So this reading is really trying to espouse the idea that our executives today really need to go beyond whatever traditional roles they may have had before, and they really need to become exposed to the more technical aspects of running the organization. Unsurprisingly, that's IT here. So the author goes on to say that the challenge of growing these blended executives involves more than teaching business skills to technologists. It's to bring them perspective change. And one of the readings, or one of the chapters within this readings, was pushing for having some kind of rotational program or experience for these executives, which I thought was interesting. I've never came across anything like this during in my work experience, having rotational programs like this, but I thought this was really good, just of people who are in charge of the better technical comprehension, because in my view, a lot of senior leaderships do not possess technical skill sets, which is really unfortunate. But moving on, personal attributes. Value trumps size. If you're going to be a great collaborative leader, you need to stop counting owned assets. I thought this point really spoke to me a lot. So the idea of value, it's not, you don't get stuck with the idea of proportionality that, if you have more owned assets or you have more employees working underneath you, that's something that in of itself, is value to the organization, to the people you work with. That's a false equivocation. Like, you can be a 1-2 person shop and still bring more value instead of having a whole bunch of people work underneath you and not actually do anything. Oh, Ed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just lost the slide. Hold on. There we go. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Cool. So, part two, get comfortable with not invented here. You have to lose the mentality that you have to develop your solutions yourself. So, ask for help when you need it, work with other people. You're not in it alone when you're working within an organization. Be data driven. I think that speaks for itself. Uh, and also what Bob was saying, like test your assumptions. Just make sure you have something rigorous to back up what you're trying to promote or espouse within the organization. And finally, future of IT. One of the authors says there are 5 pillars to this, which includes quality, the specialization of labor, working as a team, hatching the egg, and marketing your value to others. Next slide. And here are the questions. Alrighty. Next slide, Ed.
Is that not showing?
Oh, I can see it.
Yeah, Pascalian.
All right, here it
right?
goes. Here it goes. Okay, I just saw it.
It's, yeah, sorry. The reason I switched before is because I got a message that said the internet connection was unstable. So I was closing other things to see if I could free up some bandwidth. But so that's probably what's causing a delay in the slide appearing. So,
Okay.
but you're coming through loud and clear verbally. So let's go continue.
All right, great. So the third reading is Pascal and Sternin, the article, Your Company's Secret Change Agents. So in essence, they're trying to promote the idea of something called positive deviance, or trying to find some kind of isolated success that's occurring within your organization, which may have resulted from some kind of uncommon practice. I came across this concept a while back, and I believe it was framed as something called bright spots. So looking for successes in like underserved communities, like communities that you would maybe assume that would fail in every single health indicator, but for some reason this particular community has lower rates of diabetes versus other communities or something like that. So it's trying to find those positive aspects within the business, the organization, and seeing if you're able to replicate it. So what they propose is following the 6-step model, to try to build this idea of positive deviance. So it starts with making the group the guru. I'm sorry, making the group the guru. Try to learn from the people who are working on the ground. They're the ones that are actively working on a particular issue. They're developing real expertise that they can help distill towards throughout the organization. Reframe through facts. So I thought this was interesting as well. It's basically you're trying to recontextualize certain things, but back it up with factual statements. I mean, you're not going to get buy-in if people think you're just making things up on the fly. You should support your ideas with solid facts here, but do it in a way, recontextualize it in a way that makes it more approachable to others. Make it safe to learn. I think having an environment that really makes it feel as though it's all right to make mistakes as long as you learn from it. I think a lot of organizations might fall flat on that aspect. I think a lot of employees may feel that you're hired for a specific reason. If you're and signaling to your managers or seniors or whatever that doing anything new could, or I'm sorry, signaling to them that if you're working on something, trying to learn something, but you're making failures and whatnot in between is bad. Well, that's really not how you build resiliency within an organization. You really need to allow your employees the space, to fail when they need to, and to learn from those mistakes, and to allow them to explore new avenues, to help build more institutional knowledge. So I think that third part was really, really important here. Make the problem concrete. So just really bring to front of mind what the problem actually is, leverage social proof. Don't recall exactly what that was again, but I believe what, feel free to correct me, Ed, but leverage social proof was, I faintly remember like they used the Alcoholics Anonymous as an example. So I believe you, you allow people to immerse themselves within like this very human, very social environment, so that they can learn through experience. I believe is what this author was trying to put forth. And finally, confound immune defense response. People are very resistant to change. That's just prevalent throughout any organization. So you have to be tactical, strategic here, and try to get people to think outside their comfort zone. And finally, leaders need to facilitate PAK. It's the practice, attitude, knowledge approach to encourage people to act their way into a new way of thinking. Next slide.
We're still getting a delay. Okay.
Yeah, I see the questions slide now. I think you can advance it.
All right.
All right. So now we're moving on to Welch's article. So for the 4 E's and the 1P framework summary. So this article was from the former, he was the CEO of IBM, I believe.
GE.
GE,
General
right.
Electric. Yep.
General Electric. Okay, so unfortunately he passed away, as Ed had mentioned, but he wrote this article talking about what makes a stellar hire, a potential hire, I believe. And the 4 E's include a person who can display positive energy, the ability to energize those around them, edge, and execution. So he wants to see an employee or a potential hire really be able to apply some kind of positive energy or optimism to others. In turn, that could energize them, or to help build their confidence within you as a colleague or as their a leader. You need to have the courage to or the edge to make the hard decision when the time calls for it. And when you make that decision, you actually have to execute on it. And assuming you do meet all the 4 E's, as Welch suggests, then you should have passion as well. I guess passion being a way to really signal to others of your authenticity about what you're doing when you're working with others. Next slide. And here are the questions for Welch. All right, so the summarized questions for this week's reading. The first one is, Mike Rowe of Dirty Jobs says not to follow your passion since it does not equate to ability. Do you think this contradicts with Welch's expectation of hiring a passionate candidate? Does anyone have any experience with that? Do you agree with the sentiment about, is passion really that necessary as Welch might think it is for people working under him or work with him?
What do you think? Take yourself off mute and make a comment, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important, right? I mean, I would agree that, you want someone that is competent and obviously fits the job, but a lot of people can do that, right? Like, that's why you don't just get into college if you have the perfect SAT. Like, it is about a culture fit too, because if you don't really fit in with your organization from not a personal level, but from a social level, I think it's hard to really get things done, because I think you want to do work with the people you want to work with. So I do think it's important to have a passionate candidate. Otherwise, people are just kind of there for themselves and maybe not for the team.
But I'm sorry, was that Dylan?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, great. I thought I recognized your voice. So just if you would all, since I'm not seeing a notice on my screen that says who's speaking, if you would just say who you are and then make your comment, that I think would help at least me keep track. Although I'll do my darnest to recognize voices too. What other comments on this one?
This is Erin. I think that they don't necessarily contradict one another because I think you can be passionate in different ways. So when Mike was talking about not following your passion, that may be like painting or dance if you're a mediocre painter or dancer. But I think people can become passionate about new endeavors and different kind of work. And I think that having people on your team that are excited about the work that they're doing, even if, you know, the actual concept isn't thrilling to them, but like passionate about solving a problem or moving a project forward, I think is perhaps what Welch is getting after.
Good. Did you all notice a close relationship between energizing and passion? You know, if you are working with somebody, or you're hiring somebody, even better, you're hiring somebody who you get a strong sense they energize people. Would you also then think that because they're energizing people, that they're probably passionate?
I think so. I mean, it's hard to be artificial about something like that if you don't really believe in what you're preaching, you know? You might be able to do it, you know, in the short term, but being able to energize other in a sustained manner, if you don't actually believe in it, would be very difficult.
But I think in this program, so I think in terms of passion and being energetic, I don't think it's necessarily related, because you can be very energized about doing something, but only if someone tells you what to do, but you don't necessarily have a like drive, a specific goal in mind.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the optimism bias, you know, that our speaker was talking about. And it's just like, I think it's always good to have at least one or two people that are saying, hey, wait a minute, right? Have we thought about, you know, and always, you know, seeing maybe what the underbelly of issues are. I think that maybe that would be why fewer projects would fail, is because the Cassandras in the crowd would actually get heard out.
Good, good. Yeah, one of the kiss of death as a manager, I think I may have mentioned this before, is if you have everybody around you agreeing with you, then you've got to be right all the time. and that one of the ways you can get to the bottom of something or get to the truth in something is that if you have point counterpoint. So if you have people around you who will challenge you, who will ask that, what I call that poke in the eye question. And so, you know, you need somebody who's going to ask the negative question and probably even ask it with a degree of passion, you know, about it as well, because they feel strongly about it. But if you had, one way to think about this is that if you're interviewing two candidates and one of them exhibits high energy and the other one not, and the competency is the same in terms of skills, who would you rather have on your team?
Well, the high energy person, I think, yeah. unless you, I mean, is it a case of serenity, right? If somebody is very peaceful,
right.
You would want that. That's the Eric, right? The Yoda.
Yeah.
So.
Although Eric, and actually I'm glad you brought that up, because would Eric be considered very passionate in his own way because of his strong convictions about, you know, this is the way, you know, we need to do things and not this way. He's certainly passionate about his the conclusions he's reached and what he's trying to teach Bill and the rest.
Mhm.
But he's doing it in a sort of a quiet. I mean, this walking fast ahead of Bill. Bill has to kind of catch up to him. He's not in Bill's face, about this. Although he does get in John's face, at the audit meeting. But yeah, so I mean, these are what I often call the intangibles. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And so looking for those different things in the candidates is like reading between the lines of the resume, which is why you want to talk to somebody face to face.
Right.
So we'll talk more about that, but why don't we go on to answer your next question?
Sure. How do you convince senior leadership that they need to participate in some kind of rotational program to make them blended executives? Executives are they claim to be very busy people. So, but you want to build a organization where senior leadership at least is a little bit more literate about the technology they have to work with, and the people that work underneath them have to work with. From your experience or anecdotally, how do you think we should really get them to join some, this rotational program?
So has anybody experienced this before?
No.
Nope, not me.
I'm sorry, I interrupted. Somebody was making a comment though.
No,
It was Aaron, and I was saying good luck.
Good luck getting senior managers to rotate. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it probably has to come from the top. I did have a secretary general, which is like the CEO of an international organization, rotate regional managers from one region. So the one who was in the Americas region in Panama got sent to the Asia Pacific region in Kuala Lumpur. And then the person who was in Asia Pacific got sent to another region, and they each worked 3 years in the other region, and then one of them actually ended up becoming the new Secretary General, the new CEO. And probably one of the things that made him a better candidate was he had the experience in multiple regions in the world. So some organizations, GE was one, IBM used to do this as well. If you rotate people around, you probably end up with better candidates for the next senior position. Ford does this in their IT department. I had somebody last year in the class who was part of a rotation program within IT and was getting rotated around to different departments and then different projects as well. And the intent being to build the experience to make for a better IT manager of the future.
So it sounds like to me like a rotational program would only be offered to prospective candidates to be promoted internally.
It can also be a way to shake up the organization, right? If a new CEO comes in and sees, oh, people are really set in their ways, and
right.
One of the ways you can sort of shake the dust off, if you will, of an organization, and generate some new life into it is by moving people around. IBM used to be known as the IBM standing for I've been moved, because that was a practice they did regularly. But yeah, if you got an organization where all the senior leaders are entrenched, if the CEO doesn't make a change, they're not going to voluntarily rotate.
Right.
This is Erin. Just to add on to that, thinking about it a little bit more, I guess like one good example is that if it's built in to the system early, then people have that expectation, and it doesn't seem like it's like a personal attack, for example. Yeah. But thinking about like systems of governments or in like a lot of nonprofit agencies, they have like an X year rotation. So you only expect to be in your role for a certain amount of time when you go into the industry or get hired into that position.
Very good point. That's right. Some assignments come with a time limit, and then you are expected to move on to something else. Good. How about this last question?
Sure. All right. So again, according to the readings, value trumps size. In your experience, do you think senior leadership has placed too much emphasis on growing their staff count versus delivering value to the organization?
I have a comment here. In my 3x3, I added a bonus question. I don't know if you guys saw that question. So basically, it was what is a project manager? And the answer is a project manager is someone who expects 9 women to deliver a baby in 1 month.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, yeah, I mean, you just because you throw more resources, either human or technology, into a project, doesn't mean that you are going to do a better job. So many times it's more valuable to have a good strategy or planning.
Yeah, that's a good point. This kind of I came up with this question after submitting to Ed my extra credit, which is an article talking about BS jobs. Basically, what the author of this book, BS Jobs, was trying to sell the idea that the propagation of just pointless, meaningless work, has come about because a lot of senior leaders have, for political or other economic reasons, use the numbers of staff and employees working underneath them as kind of like a signal to other senior leaders that they are a major part of the organization, wherein, compared to in reality, what value they actually deliver for the organization isn't really proportional to the number of people that work underneath them. And having worked in healthcare, I've seen a number of these kinds of jobs before, unfortunately. In fact, I would even say that I have probably worked in a BS job in one of my past experiences. I say this now because I still talk to one of my former colleagues, and I have asked them, like, have they actually rehired my position ever since I left? And the answer is no. That really because there's a change in managers. So they decided to reorganize the role that I was working in, and just consolidate it with another role instead of hiring 2 people to do it. So that's been my experience regarding this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think a key point that you raised, Van, in this question is an underlying question of, so how are organizations keeping score? In terms of of who's got more power in the organization, or who has more seniority in the organization, and there are various ways organizations do that. Title is one. Salary's another, although that tends to be a little bit more private unless it's published in an annual report or otherwise. But the size of staff, interestingly, is very much related also to what the surrounding economy and the economic context is doing. So, like, for example, we're in very low unemployment right now, very high employment in the U.S. But over the next 6 months, that's going to change radically because we've taken a major economic hit in terms of what the markets are doing and in terms of companies losing business and revenue. So, that ultimately means they have to shrink. And the way they shrink is, unfortunately, is by shedding people. And so, if a senior manager feels that their worth is measured in terms of how many people they have in their organization, they may be in for a rude awakening when all of a sudden they get mandated to do a 15% cut. Then it's a different situation. So, I mean, and the message for us in terms of looking toward being IT managers or project managers is to ask yourself the question, well, what are the indicators that you're succeeding? You know, for you, what are going to be the indicators that you're succeeding?
Mhm.
Professor Happ, I have a question. Like,
Yeah.
other than the interview, you know, like when is a good time to ask that question? Before the project starts? Do you schedule assessments, you know, at certain milestones?
It's actually a very good interview question to say, so tell me what, depending on what you're hiring somebody for, if you're hiring somebody to work on as a project manager, for example, and you say to them, well, imagine you're out 1 year from now or 18 months from now. What does success look like? How would you know that you'd succeeded at your job? And, you know, that can often be a very enlightening answer, you know, to that. And usually people will indicate, you know, by the way they answer that question, what they're valuing.
So you're saying as an interviewer asking that of the candidate,
Yeah.
versus the other way around? I
think also in the beginning of a project too, to ask the project team, but in particular the project manager, you know, well, what does success look like? Or for the project manager in turn to ask the senior manager sponsor for the project, tell me, what does success look like? We need to know, you know, in starting this project, what success looks like. Can you paint for us that, what the Heath brothers call a destination postcard? Can you paint that destination postcard, or what that's going to look, what are we aiming for that success looks like?
And how do you know that that's tempered by reality? Once again, the optimism bias.
Yeah. I think one of the things Bob suggested, which is good, is he said, you know, if you ask lower down in the organization how things are going, you often get a more accurate picture. So what I used to do is I would ask, you know, for anonymously, you know, similar to an index card survey, I would say to somebody, okay, in a team, each person, you know, fill out one of these cards, 1 to 10 scale. How well do you think, what do you think the likelihood that this project's going to be on time and on budget? And the ones closest to the project, you know, then I would average that, I would create an index, and I called that the confidence index. And so if the team tended to know when things were going wrong, or part of the team at least would know things were going wrong, and that index would go down. And it ended up being a wonderful leading indicator. Well, not a wonderful, but it was a good leading indicator that things were about to go south on a project if that index started to come down. Just a simple question, you know, what do you think the probability is that we're going to complete this project on time and on budget? All right, good concepts and all that. Thank you, Van. Good job.
Welcome. Thank you.
And let me jump into the next set of slides here. Let me just pause because Hujun noticed that there is a hand icon next to your name on the screen, and so he just raised his hand again. I don't know whether everybody sees that. I see it certainly if somebody raises their hand.
I see it.
Yeah, okay, good, everybody sees it, great. So that's one way too, you can sort of get attention if you want to, would like to interrupt and come off mute, which is certainly, you know, this should work just like the classroom does. Okay. So I wanted to make some comments about Jerry Sternin and sort of the discover and harvest approach, which was a name that I gave to his approach. Van, you mentioned the discovering the bright spots, which is the Heath brothers in their book Switch had a whole chapter on Jerry Sternin and his positive deviance theory and practice actually. And one of the things they did was they reframed it by calling, instead of trying to find the positive deviant, which is the one that's, you know, the successes that are happening 2 standard deviations out from the mean on a bell-shaped curve, you know, as being the positive deviance from the norm. They called it finding the bright spots in an organization. Now I knew Jerry when he worked at Save the Children. And when he was advocating applying a positive deviance. It was something that he encouraged me to do even in the IT department. And the way he discovered it, and the way the Heath brothers write about it, is that he was the country manager in Vietnam for Save the Children. And he applied for a visa to have a team work on child malnutrition, and they only gave him a 6-month visa. And he said, well, 6 months, he said, I'm not going to have time to do a study. I'm probably not even going to have time to write a grant proposal and get grant money for this. So I better find those mothers who have healthy children in the midst of all this malnutrition. And he found that some mothers were mixing river shrimp in with the rice, and that increased the protein. And they were mixing sweet potato greens in with the vegetables, and that increased vitamin A and D. And those children were healthy and thriving. And so he got those mothers to teach other mothers, and they, sort of went viral from family to family, village to village. They let him stay for 2 years. He ended up having impact on 2.5 million kids as a result, all by discovering that which was already succeeding and then turning the volume up on it. And so this is this value of discovering exceptions. Now, a traditional IT project tends to be more of the assess and build. You talk to the customers or the senior management sponsors, and you do an assessment, and you identify what the needs and requirements are, and you build, and you may go through an iterative process, or you may go through a waterfall process, and then deliver it. And the problem is, and then this is what Bob cited, some of the statistics from that were kept in Oxford. The other group I followed is the Standish group in Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and the approach has a dismal history. The IT approach of assessing and building, just 53% of projects just outright crash and burn, which I think we looked at the other week. The discover and harvest approach, though, says, well, if you're in a large organization, particularly an international organization, your bet is that somebody somewhere has already solved 80% of the problem. And your job is, can you discover and find those little pockets of success and then dial the volume up on them, harvest them, if you will, and bring them back to headquarters into the mainstream. And so that sort of investigative seeking role for an IT manager is an interesting one. It's not typically the way things are done, but it's recognizing from the work that Jerry Sterner and others are doing that there are probably already pockets of success, and spend a bit of time to find them. And so what I had is one of the takeaways in the syllabus, this discover and harvest that which is already working. And it's a principle that we followed at the International Red Cross. And Jerry said, this wonderful quote that, this is the bet, that somewhere in your organizations, people are already doing something different and doing it better. And then to create this lasting change, you need to find those areas of positive deviance and then fan the flames, turn the volume up on them. And the people who are making these positive exceptions, I mean, it's wonderfully affirming for them, and wonderfully affirming in the organization as a whole. So in all, it's a rather positive, I found to be a positive approach. And here's the benefits of it. Number one, it's already working somewhere. That's the fact that you discovered it working somewhere. So it leapfrogs getting a new system to work. The pilot has already been run. Now, somebody may have built, an Microsoft Access application, and it may be, a bit rickety, but it's solving a problem and it works, and people have adopted it. So if you can take and polish that up, that may actually be an interesting path to take. And the fact is, groups adopted it, because one of the key barriers to bringing new systems into an organization is it being adopted by the employees and the workers and the customers of an organization. This doesn't need to be sold or promoted because it's already been adopted. And then most importantly, in an international organization, and particularly a humanitarian organization, it's been field tested. So that, it's been working in a rural setting or where the technology is challenged. And so these are the reasons why this approach is a good one to try. So why don't we see more of these discover and harvest approaches? Good question. Is that, first of all, it requires headquarters humility. You know, the notion that somebody else may have already solved 80% of your problem requires of being humble and saying, and rather than the knee-jerk reaction, which may be, well, I can do this better, and headquarters knows better. This, in a sense, says, no, we need to be humble and accept what's happening good elsewhere. And then it means there's good enough solution approach to say, well, rather than the perfect approach, which we sometimes use as an excuse for not adopting what we discover in the field, is that 80% solutions in many cases are good enough. It doesn't need to be a 90 or 95% solution. So that was the footnote on Stone and Discover and Harvest. I'll just pause to see if there are any questions. Okay, moving along. We've shown this each week just to show where we are. We're beginning a new unit on staffing and people. And the focus today is building your own team. And actually next week we'll be talking about outsourcing and conflict. And so this third big takeaway from the course as a whole, where strategy is transformational, operations transactional, now engaged people make things happen. And that this is the personal side of IT, and as Lopp has written, people are messy. So these are the three classes that we'll have in staffing and people, and these will be themes that will threads rather that'll weave in and out of the three classes rather than dedicating a class solely to each of those three topics. So Jim Collins, who professor at Stanford, who's written a number of popular books, certainly in the business world, he talks about this bus metaphor and being sure to get the who before the what, particularly if you're a manager in an organization that's hiring people. And so he says, you're this bus manager, and the bus, which is your company, it's at a standstill, and you need to get it going, and you need to get it going in the right direction, which is the where and the why, which we studied in strategy, and then who's going with you is the third part of that. So great leaders start by, as Collins argues, getting the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats. So these are three actions that a manager looking to build, as Welch would say, a winning team needs to focus in on recruiting and fielding the best team, recruiting from within the organization and from outside the organization. And Good to Great, which was the book that Collins wrote, they understand, these simple truths that you begin with the who, and then when you have the right people on the bus, you don't need to worry about motivation. And if you have the wrong people on the bus, you may be going in the right direction, but you're not going to achieve greatness because great vision with mediocre people still produces mediocre results. So pictorially, if we think of the organization as there's a modern electrical triple bus here, get the right people on the bus is the hiring part. And getting the wrong people off the bus is the firing part, and getting people in the right seats is performance and objectives. So we're going to actually spend some time on each of these across the next three classes. We'll be talking mostly about hiring today. Which hiring is about, how do you ensure you get the right people on the bus and in the right seats to ensure we reach our destination. Let me start with a story, and that when I was a consultant manager in New York City for a division of Chase Manhattan Bank at the time, I was new to the consulting manager role, And so the question was, well, how to gauge important intangibles in terms of the people I was interviewing who would make good consultants for what were the brokerage, Wall Street type customers that we had, pretty demanding and unforgiving customers. Now I had a collection of wind-up toys and was always adding new ones to these, and people were giving me new ones as well. And I kept them on a round meeting table in my office. They were all sitting in the center of the table where I'd interview people. And one candidate I had come in to interview for a job totally ignored the toys, wouldn't even look at them. Then I accidentally bumped the table at one point, and this little mouse with the cheese in the middle did a backflip, which is what it does. And he totally ignored it, focused on his qualifications and his resume. He didn't get the job. The next applicant, she had an equally impressive resume, and she came into my office, and she stuck out her hand and to shake my hand, and then stopped and immediately ran up to the table and exclaimed, "Look at these!" And she began winding them up to see what each one of them do. And she was just totally delighted about it. And I was so impressed with her sense of wonder and play, but also her willingness to step outside of that typical box of the interview, and that she had confidence that what she was doing was okay. And most importantly, she was not intimidated. Certainly not intimidated by me, not intimidated by the setting at all. Not only did she get the job and she fit, the customers loved her on Wall Street, but she went on to replace me as the manager a few years later. So this is, an observation, and I'm not suggesting that people, build toys into their interview process, but it's an observation of something that typically you wouldn't find on a resume that in fact may be an important success factor and an important connection with the customers. So the toys created this somewhat of an artificial context, but it created a context for something new to happen. And it was a way to depart from the script and move outside the box, and that context and changing context matters. So talking about hiring, there are three handouts, and actually there are four handouts, but three that have to do with hiring. They're in Canvas files handouts. I'll show you an image shot of each of the documents, but to look at them in more detail, please look in Canvas files. These are the steps in a hiring process. And most all organizations, it starts with the job description. So if you're building a team or you're growing a team, the first thing that HR and probably your manager is going to ask you to do is write the job description. Let us understand the specifics of what skills you need and what experiences you're looking for the ideal candidates. And then forming a candidate list is the next step. Usually if you're soliciting resumes, it's narrowing down that list of resumes into candidates that you want to see. I'll talk more about that process of narrowing it down in a minute. And then scheduling interviews. Most of them are done online now for the first round, and then maybe for the last round, they're face-to-face and with other members of the team. There's a decision process that's done among the finalists of the candidates, and then an offer is made. And then it doesn't end there, because then when somebody then starts, there's an onboarding process. How do you get them familiar with the organization, familiar with the department, the project, etc. So the job description, and if you look at, this is the first handout, this is just a screenshot of the first part of that first handout. It's a job description we had at the International Red Cross for a project manager who was going to be project managing the IT transition from the service group that was in Geneva moving to a service group in Budapest. And the job description, typically it covers 5 things. There's the organizational context, then the department context. So these are sort of the preambles. And if you look at job descriptions on Indeed.com and other places, you'll see a paragraph about the organization at the top. And then there's duties and responsibilities. They tend to be specific, but also some general ones. And then there's what are the required education, experiences, and skills. Experiences are often, time as well. How much time has somebody spent in given work environments. And then also provide a reporting structure, who the job reports to and what the level of the job is, which is an HR way of deciding then which salary range would apply for that job and and the person can be offered a salary within that range. And then it defines that grade level is important because every organization has a salary grade chart, if you will, and usually they have the minimum salary, first quartile, the median salary, third quartile, and then maximum salary. You don't hire somebody at the maximum salary. As a matter of fact, you like to hire somebody lower in the salary scale because then you have the ability to give them good increases in salary within even the same job. And so that becomes an important management tool. So this is just the header from the handout on the job description. And these sections that if you look at this handout, you'll see that summary in the organizational context I talked about before. At the Red Cross, we also had job purpose, and then the duties and responsibilities. There typically were a dozen of those that were listed. And then there are certain duties that apply to all of the staff. These were things that looked at the organization and the HR department looked for among all employees. And then the position requirements. So education, experience, knowledge, skills, languages, being an international organization, and competencies. And notice that on these first four, required and preferred were, you would check a box. So if it was a if a bachelor's degree in this area was required, you check that box, and a master's was preferred, then you check that box. The required list is what an HR department uses as a checklist to decide who gets to the next round. Probably the phone interview. And so oftentimes there are systems now that do this, that actually read in your resume and decide whether you've checked the boxes in terms of the requirements, and then go to the next level. It's a rather faulty process, but it's one that all organizations use, and it's important to know that if you're the hiring manager, also important to know that if you're the candidate. And the problems with these job descriptions is that they can become, over time, really dense. They become encrusted with things that may be no longer relevant, and every once in a while you just have to throw them out and start over again. And then this checklist that I mentioned on the previous slide, is also being used by bots that go through and basically take, if there were 250 people applying for this job, it might winnow them down to 40 that pass the check boxes, and then they go to a manager to look at to winnow it down and say, okay, among those 40, typically this is a manager in HR, here's the 15 people we want to have for a phone interview, and then from that it may be 4 people come in for face-to-face, and then we make our decision. You may not go through as much process if they are lower level jobs, but many jobs have that multiple step process. The thing I would add to a job description, this point number B, is I always added to the list of responsibilities, do whatever it takes to help make the organization and the department successful. And the reason for that is job descriptions can sometimes be viewed as limiting in that, well, I don't need to work on that. I don't need to do that because it's not on my job description. And it's like, that's, hey, the requirements change. And so we sometimes need people to do some things that are new and that are special. And then as the quality I would always look for is the can-do attitude. Is somebody willing to step up and do that extra thing? So the interview process, this is the multiple steps I was talking about earlier in terms of reviewing resumes and phone interviews, and then one-over interviews, meaning you have your boss do an interview as well. And then you go through a decision process for hiring, and then there's what's called an offer package that's put together. Typically that's salary, has the benefits in it, like vacation time, stock options if it's a publicly traded company, and the like. And then close the sale, because you make the offer, it doesn't mean the employee is going to accept the position. They may accept another offer that they've gotten. So sometimes what you do is you pick your first pick for hire, and then you have a second and third. That if the number one says no, you go to number two, and number two says no, you go to number three. And then hiring the employee. So where do you find good people? The number one way is by referrals from your existing employees. As a matter of fact, you've seen lots of emails coming out from people who are working, who are UMSI graduates. They're working at organizations, and they say, "Hey, we've got an opening for this," and they'll tell you who to contact or to contact them for further information. And the point being is that good people tend to know other good people, and the progressive organizations will actually offer a reward to an employee who makes a referral. If that person's hired, they get a bonus. Then there are all the online sources. So LinkedIn, Monster, Indeed, and there's a long list of these of the best job websites you can read at thebalance.com. There's advertising for jobs. There's on-campus recruiting, which you've all probably seen and experienced, job fairs and the like. I never hired anybody through a job fair, and I found that was more a putting on a show than it really was finding good candidates. Supply and demand is going to dictate your approach. Microsoft, the last time I asked them, had 6,000 unfilled tech jobs. They can't hire people fast enough for many of the jobs that they have to do. But also there for many years has been a shortage of high-tech people as well. So discover and harvest approach, also applied for finding talent as well within your organization. Sometimes the people that you could hire in headquarters were people who were working out in one of the field offices. Let me pause here and say if there are any questions or comments before I continue with interviews. Okay, moving on. There's a recruiting firm has published this good list of etiquette tips. I've supplemented with some others. I'm not going to read through this list in detail, but there is a level of respect that you as the hiring manager need to bring to the interview. Looking the candidate in the eye, making them feel at ease, and you're really representing the organizational culture, for the candidate. And so, paying attention to some of those details is an important part. We'll talk about the STAR method in number 10 on an upcoming slide. And then, don't judge early. Wait until afterwards to write down your notes and then to go through an evaluation. And also, I think that this particular firm here said, they don't stop looking for the superhero. Sometimes the unsung hero, is somebody who can blossom into becoming, a hero. And then make sure you leave time for the candidate to ask questions. So you've asked a bunch of questions as the manager. At the end, you say, what questions do you have for me? What can I answer for you? If you're a candidate, make sure you come with questions because you're probably going to get asked that question of what questions you have. So this STAR method that the Career Development Office, although I think that name has changed now at SI, has this situation, task, action, result type interview questions. And you ask by telling stories or presenting a type of case, how somebody would react to that situation, and what action they would take, and then what results would they look for. And you can read through the rest of these things as well, and go to there's a link to the CDO website document that's in the notes section as well. But you also, for example, if you need somebody that will handle conflict well, you can say, your question would be, can you tell me about a time So this is like the story approach, right? Can you tell me about a time you had to face significant conflict in the team in which you were working with? And what was the conflict? And what did you do to address that? And then what was learned or accomplished afterwards? And that's what this STAR method of interviewing is typically. And this is used pretty frequently in interviews in the current day. There are interview questions for project manager. That is the second handout. It's a much longer list than I could put on a slide. But these are the, we would do these in advance. We would circulate them among the management team and among the HR person we were working with. And we would, make sure we had these STAR type questions in, as number 3 says here. Some cases we'd ask for a portfolio of sample work. For some positions.
There's a hand from Adrian.
Okay, let me stop. Adrian, I didn't see the hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was wondering if anybody feels excited about answering those type of STAR questions when they go into an interview, and if so, if they could share their enthusiasm or their perspective on those questions.
What do you think? Who's gotten asked those questions?
Who's gotten asked those questions and enjoys answering them?
You're not going to get a lot of answers. I've gotten asked that question. This is Van. I've gotten asked that. How do you resolve conflicts in every single job interview I've had to date? And I've always gone to the default. I've always used the same one for every single one since. Am I excited when they ask? No, I don't dread it either. I just know what to expect at this point. So it is what it is. Like, they're going to ask that. And so I feel it gets repetitive, I guess you could say. I don't know. Maybe that's a good thing. There's not that many curveballs thrown at you during an interview. Like, there's a lot of kind of like standard format, if you will, when it comes to these kinds of questions.
This is Erin. To kind of piggyback off of what Van was saying, and also refer back to our lectures on storytelling, I feel like when you have certain questions that you kind of know are going to come up, it's kind of an opportunity to hone your story. And sometimes I actually do get excited because I think I have like good examples and have found like funny twists or parts of the story that I may not have thought were funny that people have laughed at. And then so I kind of like play that up the next time I tell it. So I think it's like an opportunity to practice storytelling and share something about yourself in a more personal way. And I think I like to be particularly vulnerable when I tell those stories. And I think that it's usually well received, that people appreciate when you're genuine and just want to share something about yourself with them rather than having a canned response that they probably hear from a lot of other candidates.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, that authenticity, I think, is really key. And it comes across, when you're the interviewer, and in one sense, you have a portfolio of skills, you have a portfolio probably of projects you worked on, even if it was at mostly at school, but you also have a portfolio of stories. And so, I think those are good points that you've all made about thinking about, well, what is your portfolio of stories? What are the 4 stories that illustrate what you're about, or when you've learned something that will lend themselves when you get asked those questions, but also become important to know, because when you're then on the other side of the table and you're asking the questions, you sort of know what's been authentic and what's worked. Okay, good question. And this is just a screenshot of the first part of the PM interview questions that we developed. And these were actually aspects of the job description in terms of qualities we were looking for: accountability, professionalism, teamwork. And then the questions we developed underneath each of these headings, and it goes on, for the other categories in the handout. and most organizations will have a set, particularly if there's a group that's interviewing. So if there were a couple of, I think we had maybe 4 people that were on the interview panel or circuit. We didn't, we would each interview the candidates one-on-one, and then we'd all meet afterwards and compare our notes on these things. And so one of the things we wanted to make sure was that we at least had a set of questions that we would all ask, and then could compare what our read was, on those. We also expected each manager to have some of their own questions as well. And something that's happened probably more frequently now is the ambiguous question, and I wrote a case study on this that's in the handouts also. And this is, when you get asked, as this author is writing about, and this is written by Matt Kellner. He was a software engineer. He's a software engineer now. He was a former employee at Amazon, and he was responding to somebody asking a question. Well, what should I do after failing at Amazon's on-site interview? And he basically didn't handle what was the ambiguous question. And so, you get a technical question in an interview, and it's almost always that question is going to start out vague. And it's going to have important pieces of information missing so that you can't adequately solve the problem without more info. And what the interviewer is looking for by presenting this ambiguous situation is they're actually acting like a customer, because customers typically don't give you clear specifications. As a matter of fact, I think it's exceedingly rare if you get a good set of requirements from a customer. And they sort of know what they want, but they don't do a good job communicating it, and they don't know many of the aspects that they either need or want as part of it. And they want to see how you handle the ambiguity. Do you make assumptions? Do you lock up or freeze? Do you go down a path toward a solution without first understanding the question better or the problem better? Or do you try to identify what you know and what you don't know? And do you ask clarifying questions at the beginning as well? And so, we're all really good in solution mode. But in this case, it's putting that on hold and saying, well, let's be really clear about, ask and get some clarity on what the person's looking for, and then talk out loud about what our thought process is. How are we going to go about solving this problem? How are we going to go about clarifying this problem? Where will we make assumptions and then test those assumptions? And that thought process actually becomes what the interviewer is looking for. And then there's these ways here of, preparing for this ambiguity test. And the items that I put in red, repeating back the question. Sometimes that's a great way just to buy some time for you to think about, possible next steps, is by repeating back the question and asking, did I understand that correctly? That's known as a listening check. Asking the interviewer to clarify, as I mentioned on the previous slide, and then keeping that interviewer informed about your thought process, how you're going to approach the problem, and the fact that you're willing to reach out for help. So all of these things actually become important in the ambiguous test. And you can read more about the case that I wrote up on this Amazon specifics. There's some discussion questions in the case as well, and that's in the handouts. Just to build on what Van's already told us about Jack Welch and looking for some of these intangibles. Welch's 40s in the P, energy, energizing, that decision, edge, execution, and passion. And then, asking yourselves the question, if you're the hiring manager, well, how would you look for these in an interview? And what questions would you ask? Would you put on your list of questions some things that might get at, some of these? What do you think? What question would you ask that might test for one of these?
I think for passion, this is Rochelle speaking, by the way. I think to ask a question about passion in an interview, I would ask the candidate to describe a time where they took lead on a project and kind of like what the project was about and how they went about accomplishing it, because I think that would demonstrate both leadership skills, but also in order to energize a team as a leader, you have to have the passion for the work you're doing. I feel like they would be able to showcase that by describing a project that they've led on.
Yeah. Asking them to describe a project for which they were the lead. And certainly in the description of that project, you would be able to discern about the energy. If you wanted to ask about execution, you can say, so what were the objectives, for the project, and how did you go about ensuring that each one of those objectives were met? How did you measure those, for example? And decision edge, during the project, was there a really tough decision that you came across that you had to make? How'd you go about making that? What was the tough decision, and how'd you go about making it? So those are examples of some of the questions you might be able to ask. And then showing enthusiasm in the interview. Here are, Byron Clark wrote this. He's actually been a recruiter for Spotify, eBay, Etsy, and other Silicon Valley organizations. I love the fact that it referred here and asking lots of questions. 105 great questions to ask the interviewer. If somebody tried to ask me 105 questions, I think I would throw them out of my office. That's too many. But you should be able to pull from a list of possible questions, three good questions to ask. I think the rule of three is a good one to follow. You can always follow up with other questions when you send a thank you note after the interview, which is at this last point at the bottom. Thinking about simple things like your body language. Sometimes people do this practice in teams, which we're going to do next week, or they'll actually interview in front of a mirror. I actually, when I ran a customer service department, which was doing support services on the phone, we installed mirrors in every one of the service people's cubicles, so that they could look at themselves while they were talking on the phone, and we would challenge them to smile, because when they smiled, and they ended up being more helpful and positive as well. Okay. I'll let you read through the details of those at your leisure. Value clarifications approach. Okay, so now you've had the interview, and you need to start to clarify the decision that you need to make. And this is an old process I learned when I worked as a health educator at Planned Parenthood in New Jersey, and when I was in graduate school. And I've applied it then to a number of other situations, what we would do in the case of interviewing, and I've given you an example. Actually, I'll quick go down to the handout that looks like this. This was a value clarifications matrix where we had the different skills and experiences, qualities we were looking for on the left, and then we would say, well, how important was those on a 1 to 3 scale? We would rate how important they were, and then we would rate the candidates on a 1 to 5 on each of those things, and then do the math of the weighting times the score and sum it up. And this doesn't make the decision for you, but it clarifies a complex decision where you've got multiple factors, and also makes you pay attention to the various things that you were looking for in the first place. And so this approach can be used for choosing candidates, can be used for choosing vendors, products, or even if you're the person who's interviewing and you have 3 companies that are interested in you, how would you evaluate the 3 different jobs that you have options for to help in terms of making your own decision? And this weighting by importance is importance to you or importance to the department or the organization. And then 1 to 5 ratings are based on the factors. And so this is just then the process repeated again, and that I just described that you'd go through to do this. The spreadsheet for this is also available in Canvas and handouts, and you can erase the information that's in the rating columns and create one for yourself and try it out. But it's an interesting approach. Some people have even used it to decide which school to go to, for example. The pros of doing this is that, you know, it doesn't make the decision for you, but it can clarify decisions that have multiple factors, and particularly when there are objectives that are competing. And then it's based on what's important to you or to the organization, not some other standard. So it tends to be more personal, and it's easy to get to a bottom line score that, you know, certainly gives you something to think about. If you have each person in the group that's interviewing candidates fill out one of these, then you can compare what scores you came up with for each individual. And we've done that from time to time as well in hiring. You know, it can be too mechanical if that's all you look at are the numbers, and, you know, good judgment and decision making, and also intuition plays a role. You know, sometimes you have a sense of a candidate from the face-to-face interviews that, you know, aren't articulated in the numbers, but still are important to look at. Okay, so after you've made that decision and you've made the offer to the candidate, then you've got somebody starts their first day, their first week. You know, there typically is a meeting with an HR representative to go over benefits and, you know, direct deposit of paychecks and things like that. There's a whole checklist of administrative stuff that you go through. I actually created one for UM that if you got hired at UM on faculty or staff, and there's a whole host of things that you need to do, like things like getting you know, the parking tag, where you get your M card, all of those things become you know, a checklist type of thing that, you know, it's sort of useful to have as you navigate that first week or two. Usually there's a welcome event for the manager and the team. You know, too many organizations, only everybody sort of goes out to lunch when somebody's leaving the organization. So we tried to reverse that, and we all went out to lunch whenever somebody joined the organization. And to, you know, give a positive statement like, you know, hey, we're all glad you're here. You know, let us take you to lunch or you know, or let's all go out and have beer or coffee or something. Go over the initial goals and objectives, an initial learning assignment. It may involve some training or maybe some self-directed training. And then start with some weekly checkup meetings, because in the beginning parts of a job, you're in that, you know, highly directive position, and your manager will be even micromanaging you in that initial period, but that should end quickly, and then that should be going as you go through the learning curve. You know, I typically look for the learning curves to be, you know, 100 days or less. That's the presentation for today. Questions, comments? Were you able to get the handouts?
I have not. This is Dylan. I have not seen it, but I can't really find the chat quite well.
Oh, okay. No, the documents were not in chat, but one of the things that that I was wondering is that, you know, so if you're watching a presentation in Zoom like this, your computer screen is typically consumed by this, or you may have it in a separate window. You know, going to Canvas and downloading something at the same time may be difficult. The other option is to make the handouts available in Slack, or to actually have a time at the beginning of the class where you say to everybody, okay, everybody download the handouts, and then we'll start. Comments?
I think it would be helpful to have them, certainly have them ahead of time, to be able to get things organized and situated. I mean, now that I'm home, I do have the option, you know, a second monitor that I could maybe shift the handouts over to that. But in terms of like trying to multitask, I do that well.
Okay, so I upload the handouts and the slide deck to Canvas before the class. I try to do it an hour before the class. I think today it was more like 20 minutes before. But if I make an announcement through Canvas saying, you know, please download the handouts before class, with a link to it, would that help?
Yeah, if we know it's going to happen, at least for me, like at least a half hour ahead of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think having both options might help, because if we're only doing it at the very beginning of the recording, if someone for whatever reason joins in a little late, they'll miss the message.
Right.
But if on Slack, then, you know, hopefully they would also be checking that and can kind of make sure that they don't miss anything that way.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant. We'll have to work through this. I'm a little hesitant to put things on Slack that are already on Canvas, because then we start to have things in multiple places. And I don't want to have too many moving parts. My sense is that Slack will work for breakout groups and teamwork, but may not work as well as a repository. Any other comments or questions?
I think I get the concern about it being in multiple places, but at least for me, because Slack has the option to have Slack desktop, and I do have it already installed, I get notifications automatically, and I can just click on the little icon. So like, for example, our classmate June just put the handouts in the Slack group in the lectures channel, and I can just go ahead and click on that, or I think it was in the lectures channel, I'm not sure. He put it somewhere, and I got an automatic notification that he uploaded it.
Yeah, so I saw the notification also.
So it's confusing, or it takes up too much time to like log into Canvas and then find the files. This could be a way to kind of make that process quicker.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Canvas does not. I mean, Canvas has a number of shortfalls that I've noticed over the years, but it doesn't have any notification tied into files. You have to separately make an announcement. You know, it would be useful, although I'm also very mindful of everybody getting inundated with notices. But it would be useful if Canvas said, for example, I only want to get a daily log of anything that's changed. Don't give me every announcement. But Slack may be a better way to manage that. So, I think we'll try it both ways and see what works better. Okay, I do want to comment just a little bit on next steps. We're not going to do the interview exercise. I will do a segment on that after the class and make it part of this recording. But I don't want to, I'm mindful of the time, and we'll run over if we do this. But there's a rather, if you've seen the movie The Devil Wears Prada, the interview that Meryl Streep does with Anne Hathaway is priceless. And in a very short 2.5-minute clip, to sort of notice all of the things that she violates in terms of good interview. So we'll have a chance to look at that, and we can add a discussion into Slack at that for that as well. Mid-course survey, thank you for 17 people completed that, so we'll apply bonus points, and the results will be summarized for next week. And on next steps, if you haven't already done so, and the link should be to everybody, available to everybody in chat, to go fill out the form, and please leave any feedback on what works and what doesn't work with the online class. The interview role play is coming next week. Actually, by this evening, although I think we'll relax that for the weekend, so that in light of the fact that the university closed, announce your pairs. So there is a sheet that's linked from the rubric on the career role play interview. Make sure that you pick a time slot and put you and your partner's name in that spreadsheet, and then indicate, both of you need to indicate who the job you're interviewing for and which organization, because you're gonna play the role of interviewer, and then the other play the role of candidate, and then you're gonna switch. So when you're each candidate, you should be interviewing for the job you're interested in. So that requires in the deliverables, then the cover letter, resume, which many of you already have. On resumes, I like to also, and you can put this in the cover letter too, but I like to see what, results, benefits, and impacts of roles. And then job description that you've picked, you can get those off of Indeed.com. You can also get them off of Monster.com, or if you have job descriptions from jobs you are looking at or already interviewed for, you can use those as well. And then your interview questions. So coming up with 9 or 10 interview questions that then you'll use during the role play. Readings for next week are listed here. The assignments I already mentioned is the career role play. We'll do the role plays via Zoom. So we're not going to do those in my office, but we'll do them on Zoom. So you need to have a laptop or equivalent with a camera and microphone for that to work. If you don't have that, let me know, and we'll try to figure out an option. As I mentioned, both of you need to choose which company, which job description, and then be careful about the prerequisites that you need to do. The whole assignment then gets written up and handed in, I think at the end of next week on the 21st. Next week, Martha Heller will be our guest speaker. She's one of the authors of the book we're reading, but she's also run her own recruiting business for 20 years, and is just an incredible, energetic speaker. So I think you'll really enjoy that presentation. And then I need a volunteer who's going to summarize readings for next week. I will send a note out then and ask for a volunteer among the broader class then, and we'll do that. And that's it for tonight. Any comments, questions, concerns?
I have a question. In terms of, for the interview, the questions that we need to write up are the questions that we ask as the interviewer?
Correct.
Or okay.
Correct.
No, do we need any questions that we would ask as the person being interviewed?
Yeah, you want to have your 3 questions or 2 or 3 questions that you want to ask at the end if there's time, because these are only going to be 10-minute role plays, and then you switch.
Okay.
It's either 10 or 15 minutes, and then you switch. So, and then we have a discussion about it at the end.
Okay. And so in terms of actually scheduling those interviews with you, I missed how that was going to happen.
So there's a spreadsheet that's linked from the rubric, and it has you put the pairs and you put what day and time. So what I've done is I've reserved, and I think I put this in the spreadsheet. I reserved Monday from I think 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., Tuesday 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., and then Friday afternoon.
Okay.
So pick a slot in there, and if none of those times work for both of you, let me know, and we'll see if we can find an alternate time.
Okay.
One quick question about the roles that we look for. I'm assuming we should be looking for something that's like full-time, not like as an internship or something like that, or something more short-term.
It could be internship. That's typically a full-time role, but yeah, I would try to make it more of a. Let me put it this way: pick a role for which there's a full job description.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, because we'll be using Zoom for this, it can be recorded. You'll have the additional benefit. I hope you view it as a benefit, is that you can watch the interview. Okay. If there are no other questions, I will wish you a good weekend. Stay safe. Practice distance. There is a wonderful video on the WHO site, about the 1 meter rule. If you like, I'll post the link to that in Slack, and you can take a look at that. But everybody be cautious and try to stay positive. Okay. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.